Mark and Emily Miller looked like the kind of couple who had it all: a cozy home, a bright young son, and the picture of suburban happiness. But behind the closed doors of their quiet Ohio house, tension was growing like a storm no one could see. When neighbors awoke one Sunday morning to the sound of gunfire, that perfect image shattered forever, revealing a devastating truth about the darkness that can live inside even the most ordinary families. Mark Miller had always been the kind of man people trusted. He waved to his neighbors every morning, mowed his lawn on weekends, and helped fix electrical issues around the neighborhood without charging a dime. His wife, Emily, was known for her warm smile and gentle nature. She taught at the local elementary school and spent her afternoons volunteering at the library. Their 12-year-old son, Noah, was the kind of kid who made friends easily, polite, bright, and full of energy. Together, they were the image of a simple, happy suburban family. But on one cold Sunday morning, everything changed. Police arrived just after 7 a.m. to a scene that would haunt them for years. The call had come from a neighbor who heard what sounded like gunfire, followed by a chilling silence. When officers entered the Miller home, they found Mark sitting on the couch, motionless. His hands were resting on his knees, and beside him lay a handgun. He didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't even look up when the officers shouted his name. In the hallway, they found Emily's body. She had been shot once in the chest. Upstairs, in a small bedroom decorated with baseball posters and school trophies, lay Noah. He had been hit once as well, and though paramedics tried to revive him, it was too late. The news spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. People gathered on the sidewalks, wrapped in blankets and disbelief. No one could understand how a man like Mark could do something so unimaginable. To everyone who knew them, the Millers had been an ordinary, loving family with no history of violence. Theirs was a home filled with laughter during backyard barbecues, decorated for every holiday, and alive with the sound of Noah's friends playing in the yard. Nothing about them suggested tragedy. As police began their investigation, small details started to paint a different picture. The kitchen counter was cluttered with unopened bills. A family photo hung crookedly on the wall, as if knocked down during a struggle. Emily's phone lay shattered near the dining table, its screen cracked and glowing faintly with missed calls. The officers noted how quiet the house felt, not just the absence of sound, but a deeper, heavier silence that seemed to cling to the walls. By mid-morning, detectives had sealed off the area. They spoke to neighbors who described hearing raised voices late the night before. Others said they'd seen Mark's truck parked outside long after midnight, engine running. It appeared that something had been building inside that house for weeks, maybe months. Behind the polite smiles and small talk, there were tensions no one had seen. In the back of a police car, Mark remained expressionless as he was driven away. His face was pale, his eyes distant, as if he couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. Officers later said he showed no signs of remorse or anger, only emptiness. To those watching, he looked less like a killer and more like a man who had already given up. What had driven him to destroy everything he loved was still a mystery. But that morning marked the beginning of a story that would shatter the illusion of the perfect family and expose the quiet darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. As investigators dug deeper into the Millers' lives, they began uncovering the quiet struggles that had been tearing the family apart. Mark's small electrical business, once steady and reliable, had begun to falter after losing a series of contracts. The bills piled up faster than he could pay them, and soon the family's savings were gone. Emily, determined to keep things afloat, had taken extra work at the school, covering for absent teachers and tutoring students after hours. On the surface, she handled it all with grace, but inside, she was exhausted. Her colleagues noticed she had grown quieter, her once bright energy replaced by a tired, distracted look. Mark, meanwhile, was changing. Friends described him as withdrawn, easily irritated, and increasingly paranoid about money. He stopped attending neighborhood gatherings and began spending long hours in the garage, tinkering with tools that didn't need fixing. Empty beer bottles started showing up in the trash more often. One of his close friends later told detectives that Mark had confessed to feeling like a failure, that he couldn't provide for his family the way he once had. The shame and frustration festered, feeding a bitterness that no one else fully saw. Emily's parents had urged her to consider staying with them for a while. They had grown concerned after she called in tears one night, saying Mark had been drinking and shouting, but by the next morning she brushed it off, saying everything was fine. She loved her husband, and she believed he was just going through a rough patch. She told herself he would bounce back once the business improved, once the pressure eased. She didn't realize that Mark's state of mind was unraveling faster than anyone imagined. Noah, always sensitive to the emotions around him, felt the tension even when no one spoke about it. His teachers noticed he had become more distracted in class, his cheerful nature dimming. When asked what was wrong, he simply said his parents were fighting a lot. At home, he spent more time in his room, drawing or playing video games, trying to shut out the muffled arguments downstairs. 2 months before the tragedy, police records showed a domestic disturbance call from the Miller residence. Emily had phoned 911 after a heated argument turned violent. Officers arrived to find Mark pacing in the driveway, visibly intoxicated. Emily insisted she wasn't hurt and declined to press charges, saying she didn't want to ruin his reputation. The officers noted tension between them, but left after she promised things would calm down. It was a warning sign, one that, in hindsight, everyone wished had been taken more seriously. By late fall, the Miller household had become a quiet battlefield. The warmth that once filled their home was replaced by cold silence and distance. Emily avoided confrontation, Mark avoided conversation, and Noah avoided being home altogether. Each day felt heavier than the one before, and the people closest to them could sense something was wrong but couldn't quite put their finger on it. What none of them knew was that Mark's despair had begun to harden into something far darker, a storm of hopelessness and anger that would soon consume everything in its path. The morning of the shooting began like any other, calm and ordinary to anyone looking from the outside. The neighborhood was still quiet when Mark left the house before dawn. Security footage later showed his truck pulling into a gas station at 5:57 a.m. He moved slowly, his expression blank, as he purchased a small box of ammunition. The clerk who served him would later tell investigators that nothing about him seemed alarming. Just a tired man. Polite but distant. When Mark returned home, the sun was barely breaking over the horizon. Inside the house, everything was still. Emily was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, and Noah was getting ready for his baseball practice scheduled later that morning. Investigators pieced together those last moments through a combination of forensic evidence, digital timestamps, and the physical layout of the home. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle beyond a few knocked-over items in the hallway. It all seemed to happen fast, too fast for anyone to react. Emily had been shot once in the chest, and based on the trajectory and distance, it appeared she was facing Mark when it happened. Noah was found near the staircase, likely trying to run after hearing the gunfire. The timing of the shots, only seconds apart, suggested that Mark's actions were not planned with precision, but driven by sudden, uncontrollable emotion. Police officers who arrived on the scene found the house eerily frozen in time. 2 plates were set on the kitchen table, next to a half-sliced loaf of bread and a still-warm cup of coffee. The family calendar hanging on the wall showed a note written in Emily's handwriting, Noah's game at 10 a.m. Beside it, in darker ink, someone had scribbled over the date, pressing so hard that the paper tore. That single mark would later haunt the detectives who studied it, wondering what was going through Mark's mind when he made it. In Mark's truck, parked neatly in the driveway, officers discovered a folded piece of paper tucked between the seats. It was a letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." The contents would not be revealed until days later, but its presence hinted that Mark had reached a breaking point long before he pulled the trigger. He didn't flee or attempt to hide his actions. When officers found him, he was sitting calmly on the couch, his hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing. The gun was beside him, and he made no attempt to move it. The coroner's report later confirmed that both Emily and Noah died almost instantly. There were no signs of hesitation in Mark's actions, no second guesses. What struck investigators most was the absence of chaos. The crime scene was disturbingly orderly. Everything pointed to a man who had made a terrible, irreversible decision and then sat in silence as the reality of it settled in. The neighbors, who had rushed outside after hearing the shots, described the house as lifeless. One said it felt like the world around it had stopped breathing. That morning, in a matter of seconds, the Miller home became a place where love, fear, and despair collided in the most devastating way imaginable. The letter found in Mark S.'s truck became the most crucial piece of evidence in understanding what led to the tragedy. It was written on a wrinkled piece of notebook paper, the handwriting uneven and frantic in places, as though he had been trembling while writing it. Investigators read through it carefully, piecing together the mind of a man who had completely lost control of his reality. Mark began by apologizing to his parents and siblings, insisting that he never meant for things to go this far. He spoke about the weight of failure, the feeling of being trapped under debts he couldn't pay, and the growing distance between him and Emily. He wrote that he believed she no longer loved him, that she planned to take Noah and leave, and that he couldn't bear to lose the only family he had left. What made the letter most disturbing was its shifting tone, part regret, part justification, part confusion. Midway through, the handwriting changed, slanting downward as if he had broken down while writing. He blamed himself, then shifted blame toward Emily, then back again. Toward the end, one line stood out to detectives. "I didn't mean for him to be there." That short sentence would later shape the entire interpretation of the case. It suggested that Noah's death had not been intentional, that Mark's original outburst had been aimed solely at his wife, and that the boy had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The phrase gave the investigators a glimpse of the chaos that must have unfolded in those few terrible seconds, a man spiraling between rage, fear, and despair. When forensic analysts compared the letter's timeline with evidence in the house, they concluded that Mark likely wrote it hours before the shooting. His fingerprints were found only on the front of the page, suggesting he folded it and placed it in his truck long before dawn. This discovery pointed toward a night spent in turmoil, pacing, drinking, and making a decision that wasn't entirely rational but deeply emotional. The tragedy had not been the result of a calculated plan, but of a man's complete psychological collapse. Detectives revisited Emily's close friends and co-workers to understand her final days. Several recalled how she had confided about wanting to move out temporarily, saying that she needed space to breathe. She had started quietly searching for a rental home closer to her parents, but hadn't yet told Mark. Investigators believed that he must have discovered her plans, possibly through her phone or computer, and that realization pushed him over the edge. The idea of being abandoned, of losing his family, became more than he could handle. By the time Mark was interviewed, he said little. He answered questions softly, never denying what he did but rarely offering explanations. When asked about Noah, his only response was a faint whisper that he didn't mean to hurt him. It was the closest thing to remorse he ever showed. The letter and his silence together painted a picture of a man broken by his own mind, someone who had lost his sense of control, reason, and hope long before he ever pulled the trigger. The tragedy was not born out of hatred, but out of despair that had nowhere else to go. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence when Mark Miller was led in for sentencing. Months had passed since the murders, but the pain in the community had not faded. The people who once knew him as a helpful neighbor and loving father could barely recognize the hollow man sitting at the defense table. He had lost weight, his hair had grayed, and his eyes seemed to hold nothing. Reporters filled the front rows, their cameras ready to capture the end of a story that had shaken their small town to its core. Mark showed no emotion as the judge entered, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor as the charges were read aloud. 2 counts of murder, one for his wife Emily and one for his son Noah. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had allowed his failures to turn into anger, arguing that Mark's actions were deliberate and heartless. They presented photos from the scene, forensic reports, and the handwritten letter that had served as his unintentional confession. The defense did not deny what he had done, but asked the court to consider his mental state, describing him as a man who had lost touch with reality. They argued that despair, not malice, had driven him to commit an unthinkable act. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Emily's sister took the stand. Her voice shook as she described the pain of losing her only sister and nephew in one morning and the impossibility of forgiving the man who had taken them. When the verdict was read, Mark barely reacted. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision brought no celebration, only sorrow. No one in that room could find peace in the outcome. Emily and Noah were gone, and the man responsible would spend the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by what he had done. As deputies escorted him out of the courtroom, he looked up once toward the gallery. His expression was empty, as if he were already somewhere far away. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered to mourn once more. Candles and flowers lined the steps, along with photographs of Emily and Noah smiling together. Their friends from school and the neighborhood placed handwritten notes, some with drawings from Noah's classmates who still couldn't understand why their friend would never come back. For weeks after the sentencing, people continued to leave tokens of remembrance at the site of the Miller home. The house itself became a symbol of what can hide behind closed doors. It was eventually sold to another family, the walls repainted and the yard carefully tended, but neighbors still avoided looking directly at it when they passed. To them, it wasn't just a house. It was a reminder of how easily life can fracture under pressure and how quiet suffering can turn deadly when no one sees it coming. The story of the Miller family faded from the headlines over time, but those who lived nearby never forgot that tragic morning. It remained a shadow in the community's memory, a haunting lesson about despair, silence, and the destruction that can come from a single irreversible moment.